welcome to the inaugural sit down and hang out with Kevin. My name is JM. You may know me from a bunch of other YouTube shows, but here on the Palladium channel, I have the distinct honor of being able to interview Kevin and talk with him about all the cool stuff that he has done. Kevin, thank you. This is awesome.
Oh, I mean, thank you. We appreciate your doing this for us.
It's my pleasure. So I figured, you and I have had several meetings. We've kind of outlined how we want, the vision of this to go. But I figured a good place to start is I know you as the guy who, runs Palladium and designed a bunch of my favorite games that I played for a large chunk of my life. But really, you didn't start out to be a game designer or a gamer. Like your initial love is being an artist.
Yeah, as my dad liked to tell the story, when I was 9 years old, I tromped out of my bedroom and announced to everybody that I was going to be a comic book artist when I grew up, and then turned around and tromped right back to work on my first comic book.
That's awesome. All right, so I've got to ask, because I'm a big comic book guy myself, what were some of the heroes in the comics that young 9-year-old Kevin really found inspiring, like artists, comics that?
Well, I think 9-year-old Kevin was probably into a bunch of DC comic books and things that like Casper and Richie Rich,
yeah,
and those kind of things. But I right away gravitated towards more serious fare. And in fact, I was disappointed with a lot of the DC comic books, because that's when, around the time that the Batman TV show came out with, the POW Zap, kind of
the
thing.
comics code was,
and it was goofy. Yeah, the comic book code had neutered comic books in a pretty serious way. So a lot of stuff was silly and goofy. And for example, there was a comic book that just stands out in my mind where Superman had a big red ant head and was like, oh no. And another one where Superman marries Lois Lane, and at the very end of the comic, it'd be like, oh, this is an imaginary story. And I'm like,
it's all been a dream.
I wasted 10 cents and, part of my life reading something that isn't even real.
Yeah.
And that would anger me. Now, I did like Superboy and Legion of Superheroes, because it was more serious. And
I love the Legion.
Yeah, they're great. And then back then both were being drawn by Kurt Swan, who's just an excellent artist. And then I was influenced by a bunch of the Del Gold Key comics, like Turok, Son of Stone, and Tarzan, drawn by Russ Manning. And they had Samson and the Space Family Robinson, I think it was called, which I originally thought the Lost in Space TV show was based on, but it wasn't. And it was just similar ideas, I think.
Parallel ideas, yeah.
And then, Disney art, Disney animation in particular, I just loved it. I mean, I think Bambi and Pinocchio blew my mind. And, Sleeping Beauty was another favorite. I mean, all of them. But I mean, those three were probably big influences. And then I loved all things art. I mean, my mom instilled in me a love of books. My dad instilled in me a love of movies and storytelling. Well, both of them were storytelling, because my mom with books, my mom from a young age, we always had all kinds of picture books and story books and books on dinosaurs. And then I started reading at a really early age. So, the stories by Rudyard Kipling, Aesop's Fables, and, Jungle Book, and all that kind of stuff just, fascinated me. And, so my imagination was just taking off. And I think the art stuff really kind of happened too, because my dad had some kind of very serious arthritic condition in his back that got better over the years. But when I was little, my dad was a big sports guy, especially baseball. In fact, I often wonder what would have happened if he had taken some scouts up and became a semi-pro player for the Air Force.
Okay.
um, because he had, according to him, he had this great day where he was just what he called unconscious. He was just in the zone. He
Yeah.
made a bunch of great plays, and there were some scouts in the stands, and they came to him and said, "We want you to join the National Air Force baseball team." And my dad had just gotten married and didn't want to be traveling and away from my mom, so he declined. And then, that back condition might have taken him out of that picture
Yeah.
eventually anyway. So, anyways, my dad was a big sports guy, and I never, my brother and I never became very interested in sports, much to his chagrin. And I think part of that was my mom and dad got us interested in movies and books. And
Hmm.
since my dad couldn't be out there, throwing the football or baseball, we sat at the kitchen table drawing. Because my dad was a pretty good amateur artist. I mean, he could copy stuff pretty well. I mean, in
Yeah.
fact, one of my very first memories of art that had a tremendous impact, isn't like some famous guy in comics or throughout history. It's my dad did this drawing and cut it out and colored it with pastels
Okay.
and marker, and it was magnificent. And it was just this head of Santa Claus that we hung every holiday for decades, and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And it just blew my mind, even though I saw him copying it from a much smaller illustration. It just blew my mind that,
It was magical. There was something special there.
yeah, and Dad did this, and hey, I can do this too. So it was pretty. Those are my earliest influences, I
Oh,
think.
that's awesome. Well, and so something I've always, I was chatting with you earlier about how um, growing up and finding Palladium books and Heroes Unlimited and Riffs, I grew up on the north side of Chicago. I was, scrounging for every dollar I could find. Paper route, mowing lawns, doing chores. And what I loved about Palladium was I always was able to afford a Palladium book. And in our kind of our discussions and setting this outline, you said that like your early art influences really is why you've done, you've fought to keep that cost per book down for Palladium books. Do you
Oh
want to
yeah,
expound on that a
absolutely.
bit?
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to
No,
cut
no,
you
no.
off.
Let's go ahead.
Yeah, I was very much in your situation. I mean, we grew up poor in on the west side of Detroit, so there were always comic books and art books and storybooks and books of all kinds that I wanted so desperately, and we didn't have the money to afford it. And unlike you, it seemed like it was hard for me to find work because I was happy to do it.
Yeah.
But cutting lawns and shoveling. I lived in a predominantly Polish neighborhood, and a lot of them were, off the boat, first time Americans,
Yeah.
and older. I lived in a much old. The demographic of my neighborhood was much older, and so there were no kids to play with, and so a lot of these people who grew up in the Depression or came from, World War II Poland, Europe, they
Yeah.
didn't have the money for that. And it was like, what, pay you 25 cents or 50 cents to
Yeah.
cut one? I can do that for free. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, let me do it for you. No. And so I'm like, oh. So that always stuck with me to try to keep my books affordable and to try to put a lot into them so
Yeah.
that when you got the book, no matter what you paid for it, there's just a ton of value in it and a ton of art. I mean, no slam, I don't mean to slam TSR in the early days because I mean they're the father of our industry
Yeah.
and did great stuff. But a lot of the artwork in those early days were just abysmal. And so I wanted to have books that really had powerful, dynamic, thought-provoking artwork.
Uh, that is always something that I've loved. Um, Again, the first Palladium book I had was the revised Heroes Unlimited with the blue cover, and that just launched. I mean, thousands of hours of campaigns and pouring over making characters, but also just like inspiration. Like I still the bionics section always lives rent free in my head.
Ah,
Like all like the forearm claw like diagram and uh yeah, growing up, I appreciated that, right? I think uh, there was always this feeling like I was getting what I paid for, if that makes sense. Like it was, or maybe more than that. Like all the hook, line, and sinkers you would put in there, and all of the art, and just go and do whatever. Just go out and use your imagination, and I loved that.
well, that's the thing. I I just love imagination. I love cutting loose. I love, all the things that really resonated with me. Like I said, were all kinds of animated cartoons
Yeah,
and comic books and posters and dynamic movies of all kinds, but especially science fiction and horror. And um, I just loved it so much, and I wanted to bring that to Palladium when I started the company. It's like my whole life I was kind of paying attention and making like little notes, and that probably sounds crazy, but I really
no,
was like making little notes like, oh, I love this. This is genius. I want to do that. Like Stan Lee in his soapbox
yeah,
in every issue, or every month he had a new Stan soapbox,
yeah.
and I loved that, and I loved his Excelsior Stan Lee, and and for me it's
Enough
like
said.
unleash your enough said,
Yeah,
exactly. And for me it's like game on and unleash your
yeah,
imagination.
yeah,
And I just love it when people unleash their imagination, and I think part of that too was um when I got to an age where I could pursue my dream of becoming a comic book artist, and do artwork for a living. It was interesting because it seemed like my entire childhood, my mom, my dad, other adults were like, that's right, follow your dreams and be whatever you want to be. And then you hit or approach 18, and all of a sudden it's like, well, you got to stop dreaming, kid,
that's right.
and you got to look at the real world. And I'm
Tone
like,
it
wait,
back a
what?
little. Yeah,
It's like, no, what happened here? How,
yeah,
who changed this?
yeah,
And I'm not going for it. I'm going to follow my dream. I don't care what anyone says. And a lot of people crapped on that dream. A lot of people were very quick to tell me, who do I think I am, that I can be an artist or a writer.
yeah.
Even my own grandpa to some degree. It was funny. My grandfather was kind of a contradiction. He had grown up in the Depression, and he was one of those man's man. So, he was tough and strong, and uh, could build things. He was a decent carpenter. He could do basic electronics. He could do or electrical work. He could do basic plumbing. He was just a very handy guy, very physically handy and sharp. He liked to think of himself as a self-made man, and that's all fine and good. But and I get that my grandpa and my mom and dad, when they would say, "Are you sure this is what you want to do?" They were just concerned for me.
Yeah.
My mom would bring up, gosh, do you know how many people can make a living as an artist? It's like 1% can make a great living, and then like another 10% can support themselves and have a
Yeah.
pretty good living. Those are pretty slim odds. And, I was full of piss and vinegar. So I'm just like, yeah, that's right. And I'm going to be one of those 1%.
That's right. I'm gonna be one of them.
And my mom's like, okay. So, anyways, my grandfather was on me all the time about you got to have a fallback plan, something else. And in his mind, that was electrician, plumber, maybe an attorney, something, mechanic, something with your hands, something you could do, which was kind of crazy because I am not mechanically inclined. When something breaks, I just go,
What do I do? I get a new one.
yeah, exactly. Or I got to find a friend like Wayne Smith who can fix certain things. And But so anyways, I would visit my grandpa after church every Sunday. And so on one hand, my grandfather were giving me, like, I forget if it was $2,000 or $3,000 towards my first year of school at the Center for Creative Studies, which is in downtown Detroit. It's an elite art school right behind the art museum there.
Right.
And so that was awesome. But on the other hand, he wanted me to have that backup plan. And so one day I come in and I'm like, Grandpa, guess what? I have my backup plan. And he's just beaming. That's great, Kevin. What is it? And I tell him, Grandpa, if I can't make it as an artist, I'll be a writer. And he was old and frail at this point. And he like leaps up out of his chair and leans over the kitchen table and goes, oh my God, the only thing worse than an artist is a writer. And I'm like, oh, sorry.
Thanks for destroying that one. Well, did you find other support, like from in family? Like,
yeah, well, like I said, my mom and dad were my main support. And I guess my little brother, Brian, he wanted to follow in my footsteps. And I don't think he says I was a good brother. I'm not so sure about that because there's a 3-year age difference. And so I was always trying to get rid of him and annoyed that he wanted to do what I wanted to do and was my shadow, right? And looking back at it is like, what a jerk I was. That's what a great honor and a sweet kid. And he grew up to be a good person and loved that guy. But it was mostly those three: my mom, my dad, and my brother, and my best friend Alex Marcinison, who is one of the editors here at Palladium Books, and my best friend since 8th grade. But the really cool thing about that day, sort of the part 2 to that story, was this was on like a hot spring day, like June, like next week's supposed to be in the 90s here in Michigan. And it was a hot day and all the windows were open. And my mom and dad, they were supportive, but you could tell they weren't so sure that this was a great career choice. And they heard the conversation between me and my grandpa. And we lived right next door to each other, which was the bane of my father's existence. But and so there was a side gate between our houses. And so I'm leaving grandpa's, and my grandfather's comment didn't really impact me. I was always very driven. I was one of those lucky people who I always knew what I wanted to be, where I wanted to go. I mean, I didn't quite turn out exactly the way I had intended, but
it never does.
Storyteller, artist, it's. And anyways, I'm walking out. My dad greets me, at the gate and walks me over where Grandpa can't hear us. And he goes, I don't care what that old man told you. You follow your dreams. You want to be an artist? You be a goddamn artist. You want to be a writer? You be a writer. You don't listen to him. You follow your dream. You've got the talent. You can do this. I mean, it was just a beautiful moment that has stayed with me forever. Because my dad was so serious. And in fact, it was kind of funny because in my response at the time was like, it's okay, Dad.
Yeah,
I am going to do this. I understand what Grandpa's trying to do for me, but he's wrong and I'm going to follow this. So that was really nice. And I think like a year or two after I had founded Palladium, I'm talking to my mom and she's like, well, Kevin, what if you quit your real job? You're putting all your time into this new business. It seems like it's kind of doing okay. It had to be the first year. And she's like, but what if you don't make it for another 5 years? And I'm like, well, then I would have made it. It just took 5 years.
It just took 5 years.
What if it takes 10? And I'm like, well, I would have made it. So it just took a little longer. What if it takes 20? And I'm like, well, I'll just keep at it until I make it. She goes, what if it takes like 30 years? And I'm like, but then I'll have made it. And she's like, okay, you're fine.
Yeah.
And she stopped worrying about me.
So we talked a little bit about like your early influences. What like today, or even kind of over your life, like favorite comic book artists, favorite comic books. Like what are your top ones? Are you more of a Marvel or a DC guy? Like this
I'm
defines a
uh,
lot of relationships here. Like
I'm very much a Marvel guy.
so I
I
read more DC, but I have Marvel. I have Marvel Inc. So
Well, and that's changed. Like today, I read. I probably read about an equal blend of Marvel, DC, and independent comic companies. There's some really good independent comics out
there
there these
really are.
days. And I'm interested to see where the whole new thing with what is it? They've got several titles out: Rook and Geiger
Yeah,
and Machine Ghost. I think they're calling themselves. I'm curious to see where that goes because the art's amazing, the stories are strong. There's a lot of cool stuff out there.
yeah.
But the stuff, and the artists, the comics and the artists that really resonated with me. I mean, a lot of them are classics. A lot of them are people that uh, today's audience, younger readers, may not know. But Jack Kirby, of course.
Of course, he's the king.
Um, Jim Steranko,
Yeah.
who I just adored. Wally Wood, Al Williamson, Frank Frazetta, John Buscema, Hal Foster, who did the original Prince Valiant. He's largely forgotten these days, but he was like the artist. Every artist in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s strove to be as good as Hal Foster. I mean, he was just great. His Sunday panel or comic strip sold in the tens of thousands. Heck, these days it might even be in the hundreds of thousands. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And of course, John Romita Jr., Steve Ditko. I think I mentioned John Buscema already. Neil Adams. The list kind of goes on and on. I was a big Barry Windsor Smith fan when he hit the scene.
Okay.
Jim Starlin,
Oh yeah.
Jim Lee. There's all kinds of guys. I'm sure I'm forgetting, half of them, but
So
those were the people who really impacted me. Well, and John Romita Sr. was also one of
oh
my
man.
big
Yeah.
faves.
Who was I never can pronounce his last name. Bill. He did a bunch of like Moon Knight's my favorite Marvel character.
Bill Sienkiewicz.
Sinkiewicz? Yes.
Yeah.
Love his like especially his line art is just
Yep.
spectacular. All right. So
Hey,
did
Walt
you ever
Simonson.
Oh
Sorry,
yeah.
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, like I said, Walt Simonson, Bernie Wrightson. Bernie Wrightson was another guy who impacted me. And the cool thing is, I met a lot of these guys or saw a lot of these guys when they were just starting out, because Detroit in the 70s and 80s and even into the 60s, 70s, 80s, the comic book scene here was huge. In fact, we kind of really started the whole convention craze. The guy who started San Diego Comic-Con did his first conventions here in Detroit. He was a Detroiter.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And then a lot of the Detroit area had a lot of people involved in comics. And that was one of the things that hugely motivated me, is seeing all these people I knew making it.
Oh,
So,
I'm looking at the list that we put together. Like the fact that like Terry Austin did all of the like was an inker for Claremont's 17-year run on X-Men. Like
yeah.
This is amazing.
Yeah, Richard Buckler, Arvell Jones, Keith Pollard, Al Milgrom. The list goes
Yeah,
on.
Jim Starlin, who started as an artist and then ended up doing like all of them. He was like the first Marvel Cosmic kind of, brought back a lot of Kirby's characters, did the Infinity Gauntlet saga, all of those guys.
Thanos, Drax the Destroyer, Thanos's daughters,
Gamora, and Nebula.
Yeah, so here's the cool thing, a cool story about that is we were at a little convention called Tricon that a friend of mine, Mike Kaczarski, had thrown. And it was his first convention. He had a couple of big guests, and I forget exactly who all was there. Lynn Carter was one of them. And the convention's pretty much over. It's winding down. And because we were friends with Mike, we had kind of helped around and hung out the whole weekend. And this guy comes in all dressed up in army fatigues and with a portfolio case. And he's like, "Hey, guys, I heard you guys talking. And you guys are artists?" And we're like, "Yeah, we want to be comic book artists." And we're like 14, 15 at the time. And he's like, "Me too. Can I get your feedback on my portfolio that I'm taking to Marvel tomorrow?" And yeah, amazing, right? Like, "Yeah, who are you?" I'm Jim Starlin. And he opens up his portfolio, which was amazing. And in fact, Drac the Destroyer was already in his mind. It was already there. We saw the original art for it, all in color. And we saw tons of great art. And we're like, "Holy moly, man, you are fantastic. You're definitely going to get hired." And he's like, "Thanks, I hope so." So we see him at another Detroit convention like 6 months later. We're like, "Hey, hi, you're that guy who took the stuff to Marvel, right?" He goes, "Yeah." And I'm like, me and Al and a couple of their buddies were like, "So how did it go? You got hired, right?" And he goes, "No." And we're like, "No." And he's like, "Yeah, so you saw my portfolio, right?" And we're like, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, it was all full of my own art. They wanted to see their characters drawn by me. So I needed to do Captain America and Spider-Man and this
Yeah.
guy. And he goes, "You want to see my new portfolio?" And I'm taking them like next month. And we're like, "Yeah." So again, we got to see the portfolio that got Jim Starlin hired by Marvel.
So it's interesting, like the fact that you said that he had army fatigues, because one of the, like, people will always make comparisons between Darkseid and Thanos. And I think there's something there to it that, right, Kirby's coming out of World War I and is like, this is what evil looks like.
Mm,
And Starlin's coming out of
Vietnam.
Vietnam and he's like, this is what evil looks like. And so you have like the authoritarian, I'm going to control everything through anti-life with just hordes of faceless parademons. And then you have this ultimate nihilist who is like in love with
Yeah.
the literal incarnation of death. And I'm like, there's got to be something working in the backs of their minds based off their experiences. And here's how we get these two, like, there's some superficial, you know, comparisons, but really they're like deeply different views of evil and what like war would look like.
Yeah, I never really thought about it like that, but that's a great observation. Yeah.
So did you ever get, I mean, don't worry, to quote Stan Lee, don't worry, dear viewer, or to paraphrase him, we will get to Kevin, founding Palladium, but that's for a future interview. Did you ever get to work in the comic book industry?
In passing. So my first venture into comics was Alex Marcinison and I. Well, first we did some fanzines.
Oh yeah.
Which was kind of fun. We did I don't know if you can see it well. This was mimeograph. That's why that's one of my dad's pieces of art, to give you an idea.
Oh, awesome.
And that's my hideous cover. And they look bad because mimeograph is just a hideous
format.
It's like drawing on a what did they call those when you would make a carbon copy?
Mm-hmm.
It's basically what it is. And so you do the drawing, and then you kind of transfer it onto that by retracing what you just did onto this, like, basically carbon that imprints it on this paper that the machine can read and duplicate. It was horrible beyond human comprehension. And so the art looked abysmal. And then we did Night Spawn, the fanzine. That cover is by Mike Kaczarski and Terry Austin. And the logo is by Tom Orzechowski, who was one of our Alex and mine early mentors, along with Arville Jones and Rich Buckler and a few other guys. And that was issue 1. That's issue 2. Another Mike Kacharski, Terry Austin cover.
Oh, that's awesome.
And and Arvell did some art for us, did a little short comic strip in there. And then, some of these, like that illustration, it says Kelly on it, as in artist Ken Kelly, who went on to become a famous painter, following the footsteps of Frank Frazetta.
Oh.
And somehow, I forget how, I got his address from someplace and just started writing him and sending him samples of my art. And he would do these sketches, all these kind of cool sketches, a lot of horror stuff, and send it to, for Night Spawn. And, it was really cool. And then to see him go on to become this big time famous guy, right up there with Boris Vallejo and others, it was like, hey, I know that guy. I'm sure he doesn't even remember me, but it was cool that for like a couple of years we were pen pals. And finally, at some point, he sent me some big batch of art and said, Kev, I'm sorry, but I'm starting to break into the industry and I can't do this anymore, but good luck with everything, buddy. And I'm like, thanks, Ken.
That's right.
So that was neat. And then we did something like BSPS. That's one of my pieces of art. And it was just a 1-issue thing. That's a piece of my brother's art. And then, we just moved on. And then in my college days, Alex and I decided to do an alternative press comic book. Of course, we're talking in 1975, 76. So, I guess 76, 77 is when the book first came out. That's issue number 1 of A+. Most people pronounce it A++ because we have the plus sign. That
in
cover,
the middle, yeah.
That cover, by the way, is by Mike Nasser, who was a real up-and-coming guy. They thought he was going to be the next Neil Adams, and had bad drug experience and never quite came down from an acid trip. Sweet guy, sweetest guy known to man. Al and I loved him, and he's been kind of dealing with
the fallout
ever since, which is a tragedy because he was brilliantly talented. That was A+ number 2. This is A+ number, or that was A+ number 1. This is A+ number 2. The cover by Alex Nino and Joel Stalinsky. Alex Nino was a big artist in the 70s and 80s. Did a bunch of Marvel and DC stuff, among other things. Had a big art book called Satan's Tears. He was just huge for a while. And then A+ number 3. That's a cover painting by moi.
I like that one. I wish I would have gotten it out before you said it was by you, so I could be like, oh, look, like this was surprise. Yeah.
Well, I was happy when you said you loved all that Bionic stuff and riffs, because that's all my art.
Oh, yeah. No, like that, again.
Or riffs and Heroes Unlimited.
Heroes Unlimited. It is it lives rent free in my mind when I read other people's stuff about Bionics. That's the mental image I have.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And that was A+ number 4, also a cover by me. And it was an anthology book. And then that was A+ number 5, cover by Mike Kacharski. And then the lead comic strip is by me, the Harlot one, featured on the cover. And then so Alex and I did some kind of comic strip in every issue, along with other guys. In fact, in issue number 3, I think we have a fantasy thing by Mike Kacharski and Terry Austin. Terry Austin and Mike used to be best friends. I guess maybe it was number 2. I can't find it now. It's in one of those issues. And then I hooked up, and I don't remember how I met him, but I worked as a spot inker and colorist for Noble Comics, and they did a comic book called
Mm-hmm.
Justice Machine, and Cobalt Blue. This happened to be a double, half the
Double
comic was
issue.
one and
Yeah.
another. That's my colors on there on the cover, and I did all the colors inside. And that was a fun experience because I got to rub shoulders with Bill Willingham, who went on to write Fables for
Did
DC.
Fables. Yeah. Did a bunch
Uh,
of art as well.
his claim to fame, by the way, I don't know if he talks about it much. Hopefully, he doesn't mind me uh, talking about it. His early claim to fame, because obviously Fables went on to be this epic,
Huge. Yeah.
wonderful series that went on forever. Very fun. He's a great writer and a pretty damn good artist.
Yeah.
Back in the 80s, had to be 80s, TSR was running a 2 or 3 page ad in Marvel Comics that appeared as like a 3-page comic strip. It was this continuing story, and it would end with, create your own adventures with Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
The story and art was Bill Willingham.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
And so yeah, it was pretty funny. And then I did a ghost job. I don't even remember what issues they were. I did 1 or 2, I think it was 2 ghost inks. So Mike Gustovich went on to become a professional comic book artist and did work for Marvel and DC. And he had a job that he was running short on. Mike was one of these guys who would take a deadline no matter how insane it was, which actually damaged his career at one point because, if you needed it tomorrow, he would get it to you tomorrow. Now, if you're rushing to get it done, it's not going to look great.
Right.
And so he had this reputation for getting stuff done quick. But so anyways, he was doing art for Marvel. He was working as an inker on Marvel Defenders. I forget who the artist was, but this artist was also they're almost like loose pencils. So you had to like almost go in and redraw the stuff before you inked it, which was a ton of work.
Right. I can only imagine.
So after an issue or 2, I said, "Hey, Mike, I'm going to pass on this if you don't mind, because it's just a lot of work. Plus, I mean, I'm not credited because it's supposed to be Mike Gustovich inks, but it was cool that Mike threw that my way.
Yeah.
And that was fun. And there might be something else here or there, but that's what comes to mind immediately as far as my comic book career.
So how did you get into, and we're going to talk in the next one of these, we're going to talk about how you got into gaming, but you actually did a lot of RPG art before you were an RPG writer.
Yeah, sort of. Well, yeah, I did commission work. So one of the first things I did was designed the mascot for the Wayne Wargamers. That's Otis the Werepig. And I also did covers to some of their program books for special events and things like that. But they turned Otis into a T-shirt that I wore until it fell off of me. And then around that same time was when I met Eric Wojcik. He was part of the Wayne Wargamers, and Julius Rosenstein I had known already. And so Eric loved my art, and so he would hire me to do things like this. Sometimes it was for his game. This particular illustration was one of 2 or 3 that we did because we did a TV show, a news show, local news show, where where they actually filmed a few minutes of a D&D game to show people what it was like. And they interviewed me and Eric to talk about what Dungeons and Dragons was and what role-playing was. And then I did art for Eric's first
Sector 57.
Yeah, Sector 57, his first kind of standalone game adventure module. I did all the art in it. And, and then I did tons of art for the Detroit Gaming Center, including the sign, which I painted in spray paint. This was actually turned into a sticker along with a bunch of other stuff. And then I would do, art for posters that we'd put up in hobby shops and stuff for special game events, or hyping up the Detroit Gaming Center itself. That's my more cartoony style. Mad Magazine, I love those guys. Again,
Oh, yeah.
Wally and Jack Davis and a bunch of great freaking artists. That's the next Oktoberfest we did. And then we'll talk about this more when we talk about gaming and stuff, but magic versus technology.
Yeah.
I actually ran a tournament because back in the day, there was this big argument that you can't cross genres. Magic and technology don't work together, which sounds silly today. But in 1981, 82, 83, it was still a big deal. It was another poster I did for another Oktoberfest.
Awesome.
And I also did art for the Detroit Gaming Center's newsletter and other stuff.
Yeah, I have so many questions about the Detroit Gaming Center.
Oh yeah, we'll get to it.
Those days. I'm looking forward to having that discussion. And you did stuff for like Judges Guild, right?
So that's what I was most.
So much stuff for Judges Guild.
An insane amount of stuff for Judges Guild. And I only worked for them for like 6 months. Bob Bledsaw, he was a smart guy. He recognized that D&D was very popular and that people wanted to play adventures.
Mm-hmm.
And Gary Gygax and whoever was involved in the company at the time had no desire to do adventures. They didn't really see any money in it and stuff. So Bob Bledsaw started to come out with a bunch of like news magazine style newsprint, kind of printed on adventure modules and things. In fact, he came out with he's the originator of Dungeon magazine. And anyways, I had met Bob trying to pitch the Palladium Fantasy role-playing game. And that didn't work out, but he liked me as an artist and said, "I want to hire you, kid." And I said, "Great." So now Bob was a good guy. That's one of my more famous covers. I did all the art in the book. That's the back cover. That's the center spread, I think. And there's a bunch of my other art inside. And these are just some of the covers that I did for Judges Guild.
And you were doing, it says here, 72 pieces of art a month?
Yes. So, but I had to crank. My assignment was I had to do 15 pieces every month that were a full page and suitable for cover quality. And this is a good example of they would reuse my art over and over and over. So even though I only worked for them for 6 months, people saw my stuff for like the next 10 years.
Yeah.
And me and Janelle Jacques became known as
the good Judges Guild artists. Yeah.
Yeah. And so because I reprinted my stuff over and over and over, heck, way into the 90s, people would
I've got way more of your art on my shelf than I think I realized. Like that last one you just showed off, I've got sitting right over there, the dungeon.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. I'm like,
that's
wait
cool.
a second.
Well, for years, I would have people come up to me and go, "You're the Judges Guild artist." And I'm like, yeah. I hadn't done art for them for 15 years. Yeah. And they're like, "I loved your art. What are you doing now? What you got your own role-playing game company?" It was pretty sweet. So even though they paid horrible, like $20 for a cover quality piece of art and $15 for like a full page of art, and I was their highest paid artist. So yeah. In fact, years later, not too many years later, I want to say it was 1984, 85, whatever the peak of the Cabbage Patch and ColecoVision was, Janelle had become the art director for Coleco. And she approaches me at a convention, I think at Gen Con, it might have been at Origins, and says, Kevin, I want you to be because she had just gotten promoted to like head of games or something. And she wanted me to come on board as their art director and chief, artist, concept guy. And I'm like, holy moly. And I considered that very hard.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Because it was, for the time, it was big bucks. It was like $36,000 salary. We're talking, like I said, 1984, 85.
Yeah.
So that'd be like the equivalent of, 70, 80,000 today.
Yeah.
A $10,000 moving expense that they just gave you, whether you used the whole 10,000 to move or not.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They had great benefits. And I'm like, oh no. And it was tempting.
I can only imagine.
Yeah, it had to be 84 because Palladium, we hadn't done Turtles yet, and Heroes had just come out. So it had to be 84. I went home and talked to my wife about it. And we decided, no, Palladium looks like it's starting to really take off. And my mom was fighting cancer, a losing battle with cancer.
Yeah.
And I would have to have moved to Providence or New Hampshire, or wherever.
Oh, wow. Like a ways away. Yeah,
which I didn't mind that concept because it's near New York and I love New York City, right? And that was the hub of comic books at the time. DC and Marvel were both in New York City, Manhattan. So it was very, very tempting, but thank goodness I didn't take it.
Yeah, we wouldn't be here doing this if you weren't, or if you had.
Yeah.
So kind of bringing it to a close, I know you did a bunch of the original Palladium, like art in like Mechanoids and Palladium and the compendiums and I know you did some stuff for FASA, right? And Steve Jackson.
Yeah.
And then I want to talk about the poster behind you to kind of bring us.
Oh, yeah. So for Steve Jackson, I did 2 or 3 of his cardboard heroes. I think one fantasy set and
so I had that.
A couple of Traveler sets, I think. And then I had become friends with Jordan Weisman. I had met him at a trade show, and we just hit it off. Another great guy. I love Jordan Weisman. I don't think he gets the credit he deserves as being like a genius game designer.
Yeah.
And I don't mean just for BattleTech. He's just, the guy is so sharp. So they hired me to do a Traveler art for a Traveler source book because they started out doing smaller things in licensing stuff. And it might have been 2 Traveler books, but I know I did 1. And then the really cool thing that didn't happen is he wanted me to do the art for, because they're Mechanoids, he wanted me to do the art for battle droids. It wasn't BattleTech yet. And again, we were at a trade show and he like brings me over and is showing me all this Macross art. And he's like, we got the rights to use this stuff. And you'd be the perfect guy to do the artwork for it. And I'm like, yeah, I'm kind of interested, Jordan, but I've got my own company going and doing Mecca Art is very time consuming to do it right.
Yeah.
And you need ellipses and rulers and all kinds of jazz. And they wouldn't pay me what I wanted, a page. And I said, it was like 40% less than what I was asking. And I said, I can't do it. And so I didn't, but I almost did. And then this poster.
Yeah, let's talk about this poster.
So this poster is just kind of cool because you never know who you're going to meet and what you're going to do stuff for. And Alex was Alex Marcinison, my best friend. was really into alternative music and David Bowie and all kinds of cool stuff. And he met this guy also out of the Vietnam War who was into this new stuff called techno music.
The Detroit techno scene.
And I met Rick Davis a couple of times, and he liked my artwork. And he asked me to do the poster for his first album, and this might have been like a debut someplace too, Cybotron Now. And it was really a 45 that he did, but Rick Davis and I forget the other guy's name. David Atkins? No, Juan Atkins. They're among the founders of the Detroit techno scene from the 1980s.
That's a great poster.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
It was his concept, his design. You know, again, I did a bunch of odds and ends for clients. I did various things for other companies. I did I did the box cover and the promo for this was a little game company in Wyandotte, Michigan, and I did a bunch of other stuff. I did BK Taylor was one of the people I met and befriended. He's famous for his Timberland Tales and the Appletons that appeared in National Lampoon magazine at like its height. It was like comedic stuff. He was the writer, artist, great guy, great artist. And he had us doing some ghost work for him for Tops, where me and a couple of other artists were doing science fiction designs for tattoos that came in bubblegum packs.
That's awesome.
For Tops. So
very cool. Well, Kevin, thanks for giving me the opportunity to just sit down and chat with you. Like, this is, if you've never approached Kevin at a con, this is kind of how approaching Kevin at a con is. He's just willing to talk to fans and to hang out and tell stories. And so we're going to be doing an entire series of these, kind of cataloging. In the next one, we're going to talk about you as a gamer, and then start going through the history of Palladium Books, kind of recording the triumphs, the tragedies, the successes, the design. And I'm really looking forward to this. This is going to be a series of videos and then shorts, and we're going to, package it all together and get it all put out on Palladium's YouTube channel so that you guys can sit around and enjoy it.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Thanks, JM.
Hey, thank you, Kevin.